and welcome to Get the Table, another wrestling roundtable discussion podcast with myself, Adam Wilborn, and the Dadley Boyz of WhatCulture, Michael Hamflett and Michael Sidgwick, here to discuss another burning wrestling issue. But before we get into it, if you're a fan of this sort of thing, make sure you subscribe to WhatCulture Wrestling on either iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts from, for daily wrestling podcasts where we review Raw, SmackDown, the Wednesday Night War between AEW and NXT, pay-per-views, we have interviews, more roundtable discussions like this one, and a roundup of the week, complete with a bloody good quiz, of course, on WrestleCulture. But as I said, joined by Michael Hamflett and Michael Sidgwick. And gents, we are gathered here today to discuss
starting to like it
whether AEW are in serious trouble. I may be being slightly hyperbolic with this. Of course, the catalyst for all this is
talking hyperbolics.
The slightly delayed, due to Thanksgiving, etc., ratings for AEW and NXT.
Delayed, but no less thrilling. Like just an extra few days wait for this excitement. Makes me anxious, man.
So the Wednesday Night War is officially over. NXT won. No. AEW had a disappointing set of figures. The second week in a row, they are behind NXT. First of all, what do you make of it as a paid AEW shill, as you are here at WhatCulture, according to the comments?
As a paid AEW shill, i.e. someone who just really likes this promotion a great deal, feels it's vital, is basically my wish list promotion, so I'm allowed to like it. I should be more positive, Sidge. No, about WWE, you piece of crap. Right, okay. Funny how that works. I was kind of terrified by this number because when I watched last week's Dynamite, recency bias and just that amazing Kenny Omega versus Pac match and the Jericho segment really obscured, in retrospect, what I wouldn't say a disaster, but a flat, wonky show overall. When I saw this number, I was a bit terrified because I thought that episode, based on how well they built it, really should have got a good number. But on the strength or lack thereof of the show, I thought this week's number would look more like the number we got for that show, because it's not featured Chris Jericho's being promoted. They've tied up his mini TV storyline arc with Scorpio Sky. They're building something with Jon Moxley, but it feels like the pay-per-view cycle's over. The TV cycle's over. What's going to happen next week? I did not expect this episode to get a 600,000 figure at all. It's really quite alarming.
It's interesting that, because I was of the same opinion, because I thought last week's episode, which obviously did this number, was akin to sort of the Attitude Era of WWF, in terms of the fact that you had a championship match, a match for the Dynamite Diamond Ring. You had the return of Cody. You had Le Champion Celebration. You had all this stuff crammed into it. And in comparison, I realize we are not saying that all the people who watch or that everyone decides to watch either AEW or NXT. And we should caveat this, of course, with the Dave Meltzer fact that DVR numbers are huge for both of these shows. So they're not doing as poorly as some ratings may well suggest. But anyway, in comparison to that, NXT had, the fallout of War Games and Survivor Series. Obviously a great weekend for them, but there wasn't that much advertised on there. Maybe there was a tag team title match. That was about it. Yeah. And yet, they've beaten them in the ratings, as I said, for the second week in a row. As a paid WWE show, Michael Hamflett, how do you have a look at these ratings for AEW?
I don't know. I kind of thought this week was going to be a bit of a wash anyway, specifically for AEW. NXT did have a bit of momentum coming out of the Survivor Series. That artificially inflated thing by the Survivor Series win did count for something. A load of new people were seeing guys for the first time that they might have thought, I want to see more of them. Like, quite smart and sensible booking for the big company to flex their muscles. I've never got a problem when Raw blame what appear to me, at least, to be justifiable excuses for ratings not being good. If there is a basketball game or some Monday Night Football that is just that much more captivating than the wrestling, that can explain a bad week for Monday Night Raw, for example.
And arguably, it's easy, if you're going to DVR one of the two, it's easier to avoid wrestling spoilers than it is sports spoilers.
So, like, Wednesday night, if we look at AEW's key demographics so far, the big victory has been in the 18 to the 49 category, which is seen as like the high-ticket demo for wrestling in general. And people of that age are more likely to be either prepping for Thanksgiving or traveling for it. And again, I want to go back, like, often when you use that excuse to WWE, you kind of get hit over the head with it, but it's not. I think it's one that's justified. And
dare say people that were DVRing it because they were travelling were going to watch it at a later date, or were going to find alternative means to watch it after the fact, just not on a Wednesday night. Now, I do think that extends to both brands. So whether or not we just see a little percentage uplift for the pair of them, that could just be, that might mean that the difference in viewer figures this week are no different, and AEW still loses to NXT. But I do feel like that Thanksgiving week had made that AEW number look lower. My bigger worry is that ratings kind of come in fortnightly cycles. So what happened this week will have an impact on next week, and it wasn't a particularly great episode of Dynamite. If this one, with its lower viewing figure, already lower viewing figure, can't boost ratings next week, they may be in for a bit of a struggle to try and turn that wheel around.
You said these figures scared you. Should wrestling fans be worried?
I'm not sure, because it's a funny one. They alarmed me for two reasons. One, I felt like I could make excuses for them, which I'm really trying to go for the bright side approach with this company. And they alarm me as well because it seems to have broken the rules of build that I hold dear. They effectively promoted a show. They built Scorpio Sky for however many weeks ahead of this big championship match. There was a fantastic comedy segment that built to it, but I don't think it undermined the guy's big arc for however many years and how much they've encapsulated within weeks on Dynamite. They built a show. It wasn't cold. It featured their most over household name in a huge multi-long arc incorporating the celebration and the championship match, and it's completely bombed. That's the word. It's totally bombed. So if you can't get a good rating for a show which is swarmed by your top guy, then that's generally a complete worry. And what worries me, maybe this was an aberration as it pertains to Thanksgiving and a great deal of pro wrestling fatigue, given that it followed Survivor Series weekend, and a lot of people are fatigued on pro wrestling in general, particularly at this time of year. But from the 1.4 million opening premiere of Dynamite, there's been a gradual decline, which has accelerated this week, and it's only recovered and got a higher number from the previous weeks on one occasion out of 9. I think that's a concern. It just keeps falling and hasn't yet settled. It seemed to settle on around 800,000, which we must say almost doubles the projections TNT had. So we're looking at this through pro wrestling optics. If you look at it through the network's optics, they'll probably still be happy with this number. They'll be concerned, but ultimately this is still above their baseline ideal world projections. So it's not a disaster in the TV industry, but you can't look at those numbers and the decline and put a spin on it. I just don't think you can.
Well, we did, to play devil's advocate, we did say in advance of AEW, whether you were hoping they were going to be successful or not, that as with NXT, they were going to start with a big number and then eventually sort of plateau onto a level, like you said, to a sort of 800,000.
Yeah, I'm actually going to defend AEW where I'd normally go for Cedric's throat on this. I think you've been unfair to them by using that 1.4 number, because that was week 1. It's almost worth looking at week 2. And if you say that they got about 1 million, I think it was 1 million.
Just 800,000 is a massive number.
It's a huge drop. I think collectively, it's always in my mind that I want to see Wednesday night collectively outdraw Monday Night Raw on a regular basis, because I think that's a very achievable thing. I think if you can find 2 and a bit million viewers to watch 2 brilliant wrestling shows, that suggests that all of Raw's audience is going looking for something better, and that's good for the industry at large. I don't know if we can make too many rash judgments after 9 weeks. Obviously, Cedric points out TNT will presumably still be quite happy with this number as long as it's not something that sticks and they're able to find an angle that helps them turn a corner. I think before this started, you asked both of us what we'd like to see if there was a ratings decline or if there was a bit of a dip, and neither of us said panic booking and big stars. It was concentrate on making your product great. There's nothing wrong with this being an early test for AEW to maybe, if this was to carry on for another 2 or 3 weeks, they get through Christmas, which is a bit of a dip normally anyway, and things just aren't really taking. Maybe that's a good time to look at the house and say, is everything really in order here? This is the first period where we've had to be introspective a little bit and have a genuine look at what's not working. It's for the betterment of the product overall.
Before we look into potentially turning this around, it's 2 weeks, it's very overkill to say that this is a spiraling decline or whatever. Having said that, where did it all go wrong? What were the issues that you could perceive with AEW recently?
If you look at the first few weeks of television, in those first 6 weeks, for my personal tastes and for how over everything was in the arena and for how much conversation there was about Cody versus Chris Jericho as a monster of a match, it really did feel big. you can almost trace the decline in how de-emphasized Cody's character. Like, he's been bantered off in the storylines by MJF. The follow-up to that hasn't been particularly strong for me. It now feels a bit more muddled. I get what they're trying to do, but that's because I'm kind of inside the bubble. To an audience watching, they're probably thinking, he should be at MJF's throat. Oh, he looks a bit weak compared to MJF now. I know what they're trying to do. They're saving the big singles match for months down the line. They've furthered this on social media, which is a problem in itself, I should add, where MJF's done a mock-up of Cody's list that he did in 2016, where he listed his like sort of objectives and opponents that he wanted to achieve from life outside of WWE. MJF has bantered this off with things I want to do, never wrestle Cody again. So clearly they're going for the pay-per-view, but this has disrupted everyone's wavelength to how matches are booked nowadays. So maybe there's a feeling of, oh, they're not going to pay this off, or oh, I don't trust them to pay this off, or I don't think they're going to pay this off yet, so it's not really worth my time. Another problem for me, and again, it's rooted in a good place, the early criticisms of Dynamite, which seem really quaint and honestly almost insulting at this point, is that they overloaded the first 4 or 5 shows with too much in-ring content. I thought was a valid complaint, but I feel like they've answered it far too much in the other direction. They're trying to get things over, like the Dark Order with the vignettes, the women's division with really matches that are far too long. And it's starting to feel, in places, like Dark, like a developmental brand almost, which was their key selling point of where all elite, it's all elite wrestling. We're not like a developmental brand. Something like Kenny Omega alluded to this in his pre-premiere marketing spiel. And now it's feeling as developmental minded as NXT. It just doesn't feel like the stars are there. And it must be said, if you look at their quarterly pay-per-view schedule, they're in a transitional phase of their big picture storytelling right now. The Cody, Chris Jericho stuff's done and dusted. Ditto, Omega, Moxley. Have they got a program right now that's anywhere near as big as them? They're obviously hoping that Moxley versus Jericho is it. They've teased it on last week's edition. Just feels like it's a transitional phase, and I don't want to say the bloom's off the rose, but it just doesn't feel as big or as vital, and that was their big sort of selling point initially.
Buzz. It keeps coming back to buzz for me. You can't ever manufacture it. It's just got to be there or it's not. And I think sort of post Full Gear, there was quite a lot of buzz. And I'm not sure AEW did the best to capitalise on that with the episode immediately following that and then didn't really rectify it. I keep thinking of Cody and MJF as the main centre point of this, but it's probably the case with a lot of the feuds. Like,
well, that's their big feud.
Yeah, like the reset point for a number of these characters now doesn't necessarily feel as vital as what the last thing they were doing, which is tricky for new viewers. And obviously we are all in the bubble and probably most people watching and listening are in the same bubble with us. But I personally have felt preferring NXT to AEW. I've been trying to watch AEW and think, right, what exactly would, like, when you've seen these mammoth ratings figures, what would these audiences be potentially coming back for the following week? And again, so much of this is experimental. We keep having to say this is like 9 or 10 weeks into a, you know, an entire company, not just a television show, a company really, a company's existence. But I'm not totally convinced that they've made the best of those big moments that they've really had. I think Darby Allin is the example that I keep coming back to. If I'm brand new to this product and I haven't watched wrestling for years, Darby Allin is a fascinating character to me. He's certainly younger than I am and younger than my sort of viewing habits would be. But I'd be captivated by that moment that he runs in on a skateboard, and then I'd be equally captivated by his near miss against Chris Jericho. But then cycling him onto Dark the following week is something that we as wrestling fans can go and like search for, but not something that a casual viewer might think to try and do. They're looking, tuning in, hoping to see more Darby Allin because they loved him last week. And where is he? They can't find him. Similarly, like the Inner Circle, one of the, like, I'd probably say the biggest success story of AEW so far, because week 1 we weren't predicting that Chris Jericho would lead this stable of new heels. Like, we're kind of seeing them blend into the background of the product after 2 or 3 really good weeks. Jericho abducting them, that fabulous beatdown on the Rock and Roll Express. The last thing you want to do is normalize your top heel stable, and yet they already feel kind of like just part of the furniture a little bit, and I don't know the answer to that. I don't know if it's like you just need to keep putting Proud and Powerful into bangers, or you need to have Chris Jericho and Sammy Guevara do something daft every single week. But I just think that, like, what a lot of people would consider churn, because WWE have bastardized the use of a character week after week after week, is something at this early stage that I think AEW does need to do. I understand the argument that you could get sick of people quicker, but similarly, you've got to, again, WWE ruin all the terms. You have actually got to help characters build momentum. That was once a real thing when stars were just starting to get over.
I love AEW's storytelling approach. I think it's incredibly neat. However, they have kind of left a plot hole, and it's sort of specific to Darby Allin. Why hasn't he had a match with Jake Hager yet?
Yeah.
Jake Hager settled that match he had with Chris Jericho. Thought it was a nice, like, very simplistic, basic booking, but it served that character effectively because it gave him a reason to fight on. And that would have been an absolutely killer match. He would get destroyed by Jake Hager from the size difference. The comeback would have been absolutely superb. He's got the motivation to do it. It's kind of weird that he hasn't done it. And that's the problem. Now that the buzz is kind of gone, and we are talking literally, I've loved this show. I think it's been fantastic throughout its entire duration, bar 1, maybe 1.5 really wonky hours. And yet, this scrutinization process begins at the first fall.
It's intriguing, this, yeah, because we've mentioned this a million times when we're talking about both NXT and AEW, whether you're comparing them to each other or just objectively trying to pick holes in one of the two, is you're complaining about a product that is every single week, I'd say, for both of them, almost without fail, 9 out of 10.
Yeah.
So when you get an 8 out of 10, you go, oh, that's objectively worse. Whereas, you know, Raw, which bounces around at best as like a 5 out of 10 show for the whole 3 hours.
Yeah.
You know, if they do a little bit worse, you go, oh, well, not that bothered. So is it just far too high standard, you think, perhaps?
I just think how great those first 8 weeks were brought into focus when they had a bit of a letdown. It's like, oh, Jesus Christ, this is wonky as all hell. It's not getting characters over. I just think this is the sort of thing that I reckon in 2 weeks' time, this podcast will be drastically out of date. But my concern is that the mentality that AEW has to building long-term stories, and they trust in the fans' intelligence to remember someone like Darby Allin for 3 or 4 weeks down the line to pick his storyline arc back up. Maybe the viewers just aren't intelligent enough to deserve that kind of attention and detail.
How do they turn it around then? How do aside from that, picking up storylines that maybe you want to give a bit of breathing space, but in reality, if you want to keep the more casuals around, you need to do that more often. How else would you do that? Because I think, you know, certain stuff that they've integrated, wins and losses, for example, been a breath of fresh air in the industry.
I'm almost frightened to say this point because there's an army of people on Twitter, and that's kind of my point. I don't think they're an army, will completely vehemently disagree with this. Every single women's match on AEW Dynamite thus far has gone far too long. I don't think it helps their cause at all. I think it disrupts the flow of the show. I would halve them by 5 minutes, and that's not just to the overall flow of the show. I think it actually exposes the performers.
They're trying to fake a division, aren't they?
Yes.
Yeah.
I think it exposes the performers as being either green in the case of Britt Baker or not as over as I'd quite like them to be in the case of someone like Emi Sakura. I just think less is more with that women's division, which they kind of do need to do more of to make a thing. They're stuck between a rock and a hard place. But those 5 minutes are totally valuable to just additional promo time to get characters over with the crowd that aren't potentially as interested in pro wrestling matches as we are. I just think they've pulled off so many great shows and they've never yet struck that perfect balance. They've done loads of 9s, a few 8.5s, a 7 last week, which again feeds into your point of, oh, what a disaster. A 7 of a show, that wasn't really good. I just think they haven't yet struck the balance of in-ring content and getting the correct amount of characters over. I think maybe they're too ambitious, trying to do too much.
It makes a valid point because, you know, they're not trying to be the anti-WWE. I know, you know, we've mentioned before when WWE goes left, AEW goes right to a certain extent. Having said all that, would AEW stand a better chance if they cherry-picked elements of it? And I'm not saying they should do this every week because I hate it just as much as you. But if you opened this Wednesday's AEW Dynamite with MJF or Chris Jericho with a mic in his hand, people are switching over to watch that, aren't they?
Well, on the evidence of last week, no.
Well, yeah.
Again, that's probably case by case because people probably want more from MJF. People, us in the bubble, want more from MJF cutting 10, 15 minutes of promo, but maybe that's not what ratings want. And I think that kind of ties into my point of what I believe the answer is for AEW at this point. You know, in my opinion, not enough people say enough nice things about Cody, so I'm going to try and say one. They need to trust the process. Cody has said on the record, I think, is it 1 year's worth of storylines?
Yes.
Confident that they've got. Stick with that. This is not, despite my other flippant comparisons, this isn't TNA, where when they first launched, they had a weekly pay-per-view to sell. So it was, thanks for buying this week. We need to sell you next week's. So they're constantly selling next week's show. This is a billionaire-backed organisation that has at least, as long as TNT don't cancel them, 2 years of television time to use on getting this product over and getting it an established part of the fabric of pro wrestling in North America. So trust in the process. I think the first 2 weeks of Cody versus MJF have been a real letdown. But does that mean that the next 6 or 7 aren't going to be amazing? And the go-home show and the eventual pay-per-view clash aren't going to be fantastic? And then we look back. And so a great point. I was having a chat over the desk with Andy Murray about this morning. He looked at that Butcher and Blade running as Cody, not as a real letdown of a segment, but as a slow burn tease to bringing in Marty Scurll. Now, if in 6 weeks we're talking about Marty Scurll's arrival, that's fabulous because that ties up loads of elite stuff and Scurll's finally here and, all elite wrestling and stuff like that. And we're thinking this has been brilliant. What a great, slow burn, arrival this was for Marty Scurll. But watching it week on week, which is what a lot of casual fans probably are, they're not thinking, oh, this is great. This is a setup for that Ring of Honor guy to come in. They're just like, oh, I was really into that guy 2 weeks ago and this was lame. That's a really tricky balance to strike. So in my opinion, you have faith in yourself and you follow through with that and try and earn those casual fans' trust with multiple weeks of storytelling.
It's frustrating for a casual fan like me who's both an AEW and a WWE paid shill. I got 2 paychecks because they haven't done anything for me to lose their trust. The thing that I disliked the most about AEW throughout the entire time, aside from the oddly booked women's division, as you mentioned, was the Dark Order. And they've rehabilitated the Dark Order in 2 weeks. Yeah. And they weren't even awful. They were just something else a bit I'm not a huge fan of this. And now all of a sudden with these vignettes that they've done, they're my new favorite thing. So it's frustrating for me seeing these figures go out. Take NXT completely out of the picture because I adore NXT as well. It's upsetting for me to seeing people leave this product when I can't see a justification for it, aside from just the casual nature of fans.
That's what alarms me. As I touched on earlier in the podcast, it's this rating has betrayed all rules of build, in my opinion. It's a double-barreled narrative. You've got the one misstep they've taken on television, and it's immediately being punished, and that's created, it's a hot take, scrutiny culture, and it's all an echo chamber, ultimately, so we can't really gauge the future success of this company on a few days of people trying to get numbers on Twitter, but at the same time, those two things happening in parallel are a little bit scary. But again, I do trust in this process, so we'll see.
What do you think? Because there's a variety of options here. Like you say, it is dwindling numbers, as we've seen, that has started from the origins of AEW, despite the fact they had such a buzz around them when they were doing their just pay-per-views out of nowhere and Road 2s, etc. It purely could be coincidental. Like you say, it's been a steady decline for them, but not worrying by any stretch of the imagination. It lands on a week where there's both Thanksgiving and not a great episode of Dynamite, which could be two completely separate things. Yes. They could have had the best show ever, and with it being Thanksgiving, they still could have done this number possibly. But is it also that wrestling fans are quite fickle in their nature?
Yeah, but I'm always loath to blame fans of a product for anything. I'm loath to blame fans when they're quiet at a Raw taping. So fans are entitled to not watch AEW if they're just not entertained by it. Jim Ross on his podcast, for all his failings as a commentator, goes back to the same point over and over again, and I'm glad that he does. When he speaks with Conrad, he doesn't do what Bruce Pritchard and Eric Bischoff does, which is look for excuses for why things went wrong at the time. He says, the reason they weren't watching in 1996, I don't care if Steve Austin was on the rise, is that our product wasn't as good as WCW's. And he's able to cut it down to being as easy as that. If the product's good, people will find it, people will look for it, people will do whatever they can. They'll step over their grandma to get in front of the television and watch it. And that's what I think in the case of NXT and All Elite Wrestling, as long as NXT remains in Triple H's hands, both of those products should aspire to do. If you're genuinely the best, and if enough people believe you're the best, they'll sit down and they'll watch you. The DVR numbers are the only other thing, the only other sort of X factor here is because we can kind of work on the assumption that most of us are probably watching both. So I think that Thursday ratings number is very much reflected in what people chose first. So maybe last week was more about the fact that post-Survivor Series, a lot of people were choosing NXT first. And this week, with that gone, if the Survivor Series really was the main reason people were watching NXT, maybe people will go back to AEW and they'll watch NXT on the DVRs later. It's good product first with both of these because that's why we're watching in the first place. It's a good product.
In summary, it's in good hands and you shouldn't really worry if you're a fan of All Elite Wrestling, despite the issues that we've covered.
I'm worried, but that's just because I've got an emotional investment in the product. I genuinely think it's a great force for the betterment of pro wrestling in general. It's just nice to see expressive, unscripted, booked pro wrestling thrive. And you should trust that process because I remember after Fight for the Fallen, and Fyter Fest, which were like B-level shows and probably B to C grade in the case of Fight for the Fallen, that people were getting very worried ahead of the Dynamite TV debut. They thought Double or Nothing was an aberration. It felt like there were certain booking decisions and the over-reliance on like just unfunny and drastically misjudged comedy. I remember the narrative was AEW's cooked before Dynamite happened. Then Dynamite happened. It was great, phenomenal for me for 6 or 7 weeks. And they've had a dip. It's like great professional football teams will lose to the 12th place team like once a week. You just can't assure excellence every single week unless you're like Lionel Messi. You know what I mean? It's just something that's happened that the rating and the poor first hour of last week's Dynamite is exacerbated. I trusted in that process, and thank you for pointing out the Dark Order, because that is illustrative of that process for me.
And even if you're a WWE fan who despises AEW and hopes that no one watches them and they go out of business, you should want them to do well, because they have clearly been a catalyst for better change within WWE, even if you never watch AEW.
Raw's exponentially more watchable under the Paul Heyman era. This week is, again, this take will be outdated in about a month, I would say, once Royal Rumble season creeps back around. NXT has become more vital in the live environment. They've clearly got their backs up against the wall and delivered like a much more vital feeling product than they had on the tape schedule. It is for the betterment of pro wrestling. And even if you don't agree on a subjective entertainment level, the guys who are really, really hurting themselves in that ring, at some point, hopefully, the good billionaire, Triple H, he is going to financially reward them for that toil. A lot of the guys on the main roster have got bumper paydays on the back of AEW's formation. It's just a really, really good force for pro wrestling, and long may it thrive.
My biggest worry of AEW's very existence compared to where we were at about a year ago with WWE on a sort of plateau and the indie scene absolutely thriving, was that it would only serve as a short-term energizer for the industry rather than a grand change. And truthfully, my feelings haven't changed too much yet. And then we find ourselves with the ratings kind of pretending like it's going to bear that out. I don't think it will. But that was just my belief, was that this was only ever going to be like a short-term shot in the arm rather than a long-term fix or a long-term change. But AEW kind of got, if there are people like that, like myself, I'm trying to have a balanced take on it. Like AEW have got to keep working to prove that wrong. The products, if AEW are in business in a year and the product's still amazing, if Dynamite's still quality and they're still doing over 500,000 pay-per-views doing well, like I'm profoundly mistaken, because it's just been an absolute success, a year of solid pro wrestling. And really, as a fan first, that's really all any of us should be looking forward to, just more great wrestling.
Well, let us know your thoughts on everything we've discussed in the comments section below. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And subscribe to What Culture Wrestling on either iTunes, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts from, for daily wrestling podcasts. Myself and the Dadley Boyz dissecting Raw earlier on today, if you want to go and check that out.
We are so much more entertaining than the actual show. Genuinely. If you're thinking I was a crap show, I'm not going to listen to people review it. We had a bit of fun.
We barely mentioned the show imperfectly.
Yeah, that was great.
Let us know your thoughts as well on Twitter at WhatCultureWWE. While you're there, follow all three of us. You can follow Michael Hamflett at
Michael Hamflett.
Follow Michael Sidgwick at
Sidgwick.
Follow me at Adam Wilborn. As I said, follow us all at WhatCultureWWE. My thanks to the Dadley Boyz. Thank you for watching, and we will see you soon.